Did medieval nuns always live lives of quiet devotion, hidden away from the world's clamor? What truly went on behind those ancient convent walls? Could secrets of illicit affairs, open defiance, and even dark crimes lurk within the annals of the medieval church? From the 12th to the 15th centuries, the lives of religious women were not always as pious as painted. Number 9. The Convent of the Loose Women in Venice. The sun-drenched canals of Venice in the early 15th century buzzed with the sound of merchants and the distant murmur of church bells. Amongst the city's numerous religious houses, the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie was supposed to be an island of spiritual discipline, a place where noble daughters and devout women dedicated their lives to God. However, by 1415, the whispers about Santa Maria delle Grazie had grown into a roar that echoed through the Doge's palace and reached the ears of the Patriarch of Venice himself. This was not a convent known for its piety, but for its scandalous reputation as a haven for women more interested in earthly pleasures than heavenly salvation. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most convents, demanded strict enclosure, modesty, and poverty. Yet, at Santa Maria, these vows seemed to be mere suggestions. Accounts from various ecclesiastical inspections and reports by local citizens painted a vivid, disturbing picture of a convent utterly devoid of monastic discipline. The nuns, many of them from wealthy Venetian families who had placed them there for convenience or status, had largely abandoned their habits for fine secular clothing. Silks, velvets, and costly jewels adorned their persons, more fitting for a noble woman attending a ball than a bride of Christ. Their hair, which should have been shorn or kept modestly under a veil, was styled and sometimes even dyed, defying centuries of monastic tradition. The enclosure, a fundamental aspect of convent life meant to separate the nuns from the temptations of the outside world, was practically non-existent. The convent's gates stood open for visitors at almost any hour. Men, including brothers, cousins, and even unknown individuals, were frequently seen entering and exiting the cloister. The nuns themselves would often leave the convent walls, not for pious duties or charitable works, but for excursions into the city. They attended feasts, enjoyed public spectacles, and even went on pleasure boat rides along the canals, mingling freely with the secular populace. These activities were not discreet. They were often quite public, causing considerable scandal in the devout Venetian society. Reports lodged with the Patriarch detailed how the nuns regularly hosted grand banquets within the convent. These were not simple, frugal, monastic meals. Instead, they were lavish affairs, complete with multiple courses of rich food, fine wines, and musical entertainment. Secular guests, both male and female, were frequently invited to these gatherings, transforming the sacred space into a venue for social merriment. The sounds of laughter, music, and conversation, sometimes stretching late into the night, carried beyond the convent walls, painting a stark contrast to the expected silence and prayer of a religious house. Even more shocking were the allegations of gambling. Cards and dice, tools of worldly amusement and potential financial ruin, were reportedly played openly within the convent. Sums of money, meant for the upkeep of the convent or for charitable works, were wagered and lost. This activity not only violated the vow of poverty, but also undermined the spiritual focus that should have permeated every aspect of monastic life. The spiritual duties themselves had fallen into disarray. Mass was infrequently celebrated, and the divine office, the daily cycle of prayers and psalms, was often neglected or performed carelessly. The nuns displayed little interest in spiritual instruction or pious readings. Instead, their conversations revolved around worldly matters, fashion, gossip, and the affairs of the city. The overall atmosphere was one of profound spiritual laxity, bordering on indifference. The Patriarch of Venice, after receiving numerous complaints and confirming the veracity of the reports through his own investigations, felt compelled to act. He issued a stern decree to the abbess and the community of Santa Maria delle Grazie. The decree detailed the litany of abuses and demanded immediate and drastic reforms, mandated strict enclosure forbidding nuns from leaving the convent without explicit permission and for genuine, urgent reasons, prohibited the wearing of secular clothes and jewels, insisting on the simple monastic habit. All forms of gambling and lavish entertainment were strictly forbidden. Male visitors were to be severely restricted and only allowed in designated public areas, never in the private quarters of the nuns. The decree also called for a renewed commitment to the divine office and spiritual discipline. However, the nuns of Santa Maria delle Grazie, accustomed to their indulgent lifestyle, did not readily comply. Initial attempts at reform met with passive resistance and outright defiance. The abbess herself seemed unable or unwilling to enforce the patriarch's orders effectively, possibly due to her own complicity in the lax regime or the powerful family connections of many of the nuns. The situation became a long-standing challenge for the patriarchate, requiring repeated interventions and visitations. The scandal of the loose women of Venice served as a stark reminder of the constant tension between religious ideals and human frailty, especially when combined with wealth and privilege. Convent's reputation, once synonymous with piety, became a byword for a different kind of life altogether. The city of Venice, always tolerant of a certain amount of excess, found even its patience tested by the open defiance of monastic norms. Number 8. The case of Sister Agnes and the abbot's son. In the heart of Bavaria, during the 14th century, the Benedictine convent of St Walburga stood as a beacon of quiet devotion, its stone walls enclosing a community of women dedicated to prayer and contemplation, or so it appeared from the outside. Yet within its hallowed confines, a secret relationship, born of forbidden desires, festered and eventually erupted into a scandal that shocked the local ecclesiastical authorities and reverberated through the regional church. This was the story of Sister Agnes, a young nun and the son of a neighboring abbot. Sister Agnes, a woman known for her striking beauty, had taken her vows years prior, dedicating herself to a life of chastity and obedience. Convent of St Walburga maintained traditional ties with the nearby Benedictine Abbey of Saints Peter and Paul, where a revered abbot presided. The abbot had a son, a young man who was not destined for the monastic life, but often visited his father at the abbey. It was during these visits, perhaps at shared religious functions or through the limited channels of communication allowed between the two religious houses, that Sister Agnes and the abbot's son, known in the records as Conrad, developed a dangerous affection. Their encounters were clandestine, shrouded in secrecy and daring. The strict enclosure rules of the convent were circumvented with cunning and stealth. Accounts from later investigations suggested that Conrad would gain access to the convent under various pretexts, perhaps pretending to deliver messages or assist with convent affairs. Sister Agnes, it was alleged, would facilitate these meetings, possibly with the complicity of some sympathetic or bribed convent staff, or by exploiting lax oversight during certain hours. The medieval convent, while seemingly impenetrable, often had back gates, hidden passages, or even friendly gardeners who could be persuaded to look the other way. The illicit affair continued for a significant period, fueled by a dangerous combination of passion and the thrill of forbidden transgression. Close-knit nature of monastic communities, however, meant that such a secret could not remain hidden indefinitely. Whispers began to circulate amongst the other sisters, growing louder as time passed. These were the hushed tones of suspicion, knowing glances, and the gradual accumulation of small details that pointed towards something deeply amiss. The changes in Sister Agnes's demeanor, her occasional absences, or perhaps even the subtle changes in her physical appearance, would have eventually become noticeable to those who lived in such close quarters. The inevitable discovery came with the undeniable evidence of a pregnancy. Sister Agnes, in defiance of her solemn vow of chastity, was found to be with child. This revelation plunged the convent into immediate crisis. Pregnant nun was not only a profound personal sin in the eyes of the Church, but also a public disgrace for the entire community and institution. The abbess, faced with this devastating truth, was forced to act. The immediate concern would have been to manage the scandal, protect the convent's reputation, and determine the paternity of the child. Under intense pressure, Sister Agnes confessed to the affair, naming Conrad, the abbot's son, as the father. This revelation compounded the scandal, drawing in a prominent figure from the local ecclesiastical hierarchy and his family. The abbot, a man of significant standing, faced not only the humiliation of his son's actions, but also the direct challenge to the authority and integrity of his own house and the wider church. The consequences were swift and severe. The local bishop, upon learning of the incident, launched a formal investigation. Diocesan records from the period detail the interrogations of Sister Agnes, Conrad, and various members of the convent and abbey staff. The aim was to uncover the full extent of the transgression, identify any accomplices, and administer appropriate penance and punishment. The gravity of the offense, involving a breach of vows and a public scandal, demanded a firm response. Sister Agnes was removed from the convent. Her future was uncertain, but for a pregnant nun in medieval society, options were severely limited. She might have been sent to a Magdalene asylum, a house for penitent women, or forced to live in utter seclusion and penance. The records often do not follow such individuals beyond their expulsion, leaving their subsequent fates shrouded in obscurity. Conrad, the abbot's son, also faced repercussions. While not bound by vows of chastity, his involvement in the scandal, particularly with a consecrated nun, was deemed a grave moral offense. His father, the abbot, likely endured considerable pressure and censure from his peers and superiors. The abbot himself may have been subject to a visitation or investigation to determine if his oversight or conduct somehow contributed to his son's access or behavior. The scandal cast a long shadow over both religious houses, damaging their prestige and moral authority in the region for years to come. The case of Sister Agnes and Conrad became a cautionary tale, whispered among the clergy and laity about the dangers of temptation and the severe consequences of violating sacred vows. Number 7. The Fighting Nuns of Warewell Abbey. The year is 1230. In the verdant landscape of Hampshire, England, the stately Benedictine Abbey of Warewell, founded centuries earlier, stood as a significant religious institution, its abbess a powerful landowner and spiritual leader. However, this year the tranquility of the abbey was shattered not by external invasion, but by an internal rebellion of extraordinary ferocity. The nuns of Warewell, driven by a deep resentment towards their newly appointed abbess Eleanor Gifford, resorted to open defiance, physical resistance, and even barricading themselves within their own sacred enclosure. The trouble began with the death of the previous abbess. According to established custom and canonical law, the election of a new abbess was usually conducted by the nuns themselves, supervised by the Bishop of Winchester, in whose diocese Warewell Abbey lay. However, on this occasion, the process took an unexpected turn. Peter de Roche, the formidable Bishop of Winchester, decided to bypass the traditional electoral process. Instead, he simply appointed his own niece, Eleanor Gifford, to the coveted position. Eleanor was a well-connected woman from a powerful family, and possibly known for her strict adherence to rules. While the bishop might have believed he was installing a capable leader, his unilateral action ignored the nuns' rights and established monastic traditions. The nuns of Warewell were incensed. They viewed the bishop's act as a blatant usurpation of their ancient rights and a profound insult to their community. They considered Eleanor Giffard an illegitimate abbess, a puppet of the bishop rather than a spiritual leader chosen by their own free will. Their initial protests were verbal petitions and complaints sent to the bishop, but these went unheeded. The bishop, a man known for his strong will and political influence, was determined to have his way. As Eleanor Giffard approached the abbey, ready to take up her new role, the nuns escalated their resistance. They refused her entry. The great gates of Warewell Abbey, normally welcoming to their new superior, were barred and fortified. The nuns, unified in their defiance, prepared for a siege. They barricaded the entrance, reinforcing the doors and walls, and made it clear that Eleanor Giffard would not enter their cloister as their abbess. What unfolded next was a scene of remarkable defiance. When Eleanor Giffard, accompanied by Bishop Peter de Roche and his retinue, attempted to formally enter the abbey, they found themselves facing an unyielding fortress. The nuns, from behind their makeshift defenses, shouted their protests and their rejection of her authority. The situation quickly devolved into a physical confrontation. The bishop's men attempted to force their way in, but they were met with surprising resistance from the cloistered women. The historical accounts describe an almost unbelievable scene. The nuns, renowned for their spiritual devotion, transformed into a determined defensive force. They allegedly threw stones, tiles, and even boiling water down from the abbey walls onto the bishop's party. Chroniclers of the time, often sympathetic to established authority, painted a picture of nuns acting with an uncharacteristic ferocity, more like rebellious serfs than cloistered virgins. Their resolve was extraordinary. Fueled by a profound sense of injustice and a fierce desire to protect their community's autonomy, the standoff lasted for several days. Bishop Peter de Roche, accustomed to immediate obedience, was astonished and enraged by the nuns' audacity. Could not believe that a group of women bound by vows of obedience and supposedly detached from worldly struggles would openly defy his authority in such a violent manner. He dispatched letters to King Henry III complaining about the nuns' unprecedented insubordination and seeking royal assistance to restore order. King, recognizing the challenge to both ecclesiastical and secular authority, sided with the bishop. With royal backing, Bishop Peter de Roche intensified his efforts. He ordered the siege to be maintained, cutting off supplies to the abbey. The nuns, however, still refused to yield. The situation became a public spectacle, the news of the fighting nuns spreading throughout England. It was an embarrassment for the Church and a scandal that demonstrated the depth of resentment against powerful bishops who overstepped their authority. Eventually, the bishop, with the king's support, found a way to break the deadlock. It was not through direct assault, but through legal and spiritual means. The nuns were excommunicated for their disobedience and violence against a bishop. Excommunication was a terrifying prospect in the medieval world, severing an individual from the sacraments and spiritual life. Faced with this ultimate spiritual sanction and the continued blockade, the nuns' defiance began to wane. After weeks of siege and isolation, the nuns of Warewell finally capitulated. They surrendered their resistance and allowed Eleanor Giffard to enter and assume her role as abbess. However, their capitulation did not come without consequences. The ringleaders of the rebellion, identified by the bishop's investigation, faced severe penance. Some were reportedly sent to other convents, effectively exiled, or placed under strict spiritual discipline within Warewell. The abbey itself likely underwent a period of rigorous spiritual reform to reassert episcopal authority and restore order. The fighting nuns of Warewell Abbey became a legend, a testament to the unexpected power of collective resistance, even from within the confines of a religious institution. Number 6. The accused heretics of Posi. In the early 14th century, amidst the grand intellectual and theological currents of medieval France, the royal convent of Posi, home to a community of Dominican nuns, found itself embroiled in a chilling scandal. This was not a scandal of moral laxity or defiance of authority in the usual sense, but one far more dangerous in the eyes of the Church, the dreaded stain of heresy. Within the very walls dedicated to Orthodox Catholic faith, some nuns were accused of embracing beliefs that diverged from the established doctrines, drawing the terrifying scrutiny of the Dominican order and the wider Inquisition. Posi was no ordinary convent. It held significant prestige as a royal foundation, often housing daughters of the French nobility. Spiritual oversight fell under the strict purview of the Dominican order, known for its intellectual rigor and its zealous role in combating heresy. This very connection, which usually ensured doctrinal purity, ironically became the instrument of the nuns' undoing. The initial whispers of unorthodox beliefs began subtly. They were not about overt rebellion against the Pope or the Church, but rather about nuanced theological interpretations that, to the trained eyes of Dominican inquisitors, veered into dangerous territory. The specific nature of the alleged heresies remains somewhat veiled in the historical records, but they often involved interpretations of mystical experiences, the nature of God, the role of sacraments, or the path to salvation that deviated from accepted dogma. Sometimes, these deviations stemmed from a genuine misunderstanding of complex theology, or from the influence of modic individuals who held unconventional views. The accusations often arose from internal denunciations. Nuns, perhaps concerned about the spiritual well-being of their sisters or genuinely alarmed by the ideas being discussed, would report their observations to the abbess, or more gravely directly to the Dominican friars who served as their confessors and spiritual directors. These friars, acutely attuned to any hint of heterodoxy, would have felt compelled to investigate thoroughly, as heresy was considered a plague that could spread quickly and corrupt an entire community. The formal investigation, once launched, was a solemn and terrifying affair. Dominican inquisitors, armed with the authority of the Church, descended upon the convent. Their arrival would have cast a pall of fear and suspicion over the entire community. Every nun was a potential suspect, and every conversation a potential source of incriminating evidence. The process involved rigorous interrogations, often conducted privately and with a relentless pursuit of doctrinal clarity. Nuns were questioned about their beliefs, their understanding of key theological concepts, their associations, and any conversations they had engaged in regarding spiritual matters. The methods of interrogation were designed to uncover even the slightest deviation from orthodoxy. Inquisitors would ask leading questions, compare testimonies, and look for inconsistencies. They sought to identify the heresiarchs, the main proponents of the unorthodox views, and to determine the extent to which the ideas had permeated the community. The atmosphere within the convent would have been one of profound anxiety and distrust, shattering the communal peace that was supposed to define monastic life. While the exact nature of the heresies is not always fully detailed, medieval heresy often involved apostolic poverty, radical interpretations of Christ's poverty, sometimes leading to rejection of church wealth, spiritualism, emphasis on direct revelation and inner spiritual experience over sacraments or clerical authority, antinomianism, the belief that one was freed from moral law once justified by faith, potentially leading to immoral conduct. Dualism, belief in two opposing gods, one good and one evil, often seen in Catholicism. Rejection of sacraments, doubts about the efficacy of baptism, communion, or confession. The inquisitors' reports from Posi would have detailed the specific allegations, the names of the accused nuns, and their responses to the interrogations. Some nuns might have recanted their beliefs, perhaps out of genuine conviction or out of fear of the consequences. Others might have stubbornly held to their views, risking severe punishment. The consequences for nuns found guilty of heresy were dire. Minor deviations might result in public penance, rigorous fasting, or a period of strict confinement within the convent. More serious offenses could lead to imprisonment, degradation from their religious status, or even transference to another stricter convent for permanent penance. For those deemed truly unrepentant, the secular authorities acting on the Church's condemnation could impose even harsher sentences, though execution was rare for nuns due to their consecrated status, but not entirely unheard of in extreme cases of unrepentant public heresy. The scandal of the accused heretics of Posi served as a chilling reminder that even within the supposedly impenetrable walls of a royal convent, the Church's eternal vigilance against doctrinal error was absolute. It demonstrated the power of the Inquisition and the pervasive fear of heresy that gripped medieval society. The convent itself would have been subjected to a thorough cleansing, its spiritual life restructured, and its members closely monitored to ensure no trace of the condemned beliefs remained. The incident underscored the delicate balance between personal spiritual experience and institutional control, a balance that, when disturbed, could lead to devastating consequences for those who dared to stray from the path of orthodoxy. Number 5. The Gambling Convent of Augsburg. In the late 15th century, as the Holy Roman Empire stood on the cusp of profound change, the city of Augsburg, a thriving center of trade and finance, was accustomed to the ebb and flow of wealth and its associated temptations. However, the convent of St Ursula, nestled within the city's ancient walls, was supposed to be a sanctuary from such worldly concerns. Instead, it became infamous for its deep immersion in the very vices it was meant to transcend. The nuns of St Ursula, particularly its leadership, were accused of leading lives of shocking extravagance, engaging in rampant gambling and plunging their sacred house into a morass of debt. The rules of religious orders, particularly the Benedictine rule by which St Ursula operated, strictly enjoined poverty, simplicity, and a focus on spiritual rather than material wealth. Nuns were expected to live modestly, their clothing simple, their meals frugal, and their daily routines centered on prayer, work, and study. Yet the reports reaching the Bishop of Augsburg, and later the Emperor himself, painted a picture of a convent that had dramatically departed from these ideals. The Abbis and many of the nuns at St Ursula had developed a taste for luxuries far beyond what was appropriate for their station. Their cells, meant to be sparsely furnished, were adorned with expensive tapestries, elaborate furniture, and fine ornaments. Their habits, while outwardly conforming to the rule, were often made of costly fabrics, lined with rich furs, and sometimes even embellished with discreet but extravagant embroidery. Fine jewelry, forbidden by their vows, was reportedly worn openly even during church services. Their diet, too, was far from the simple fare of monastic life. Lavish banquets, featuring expensive meats, imported spices, and abundant wine, were said to be a regular occurrence within the convent refectory, rather than just for special guests. The most egregious of their transgressions, however, was their addiction to gambling. Cards and dice, games of chance associated with taverns and secular revelry, were played with alarming frequency within the convent walls. The stakes were often high, and the nuns, particularly the abbess and her favored companions, were reported to have lost substantial sums of money. This was not small-time amusement. It was serious, high-stakes gambling that drained the convent's meager resources. Convent's financial situation became increasingly precarious. The dowries brought by incoming nuns, meant to sustain the community, were squandered. Income from convent properties and endowments, intended for charitable works, the upkeep of the buildings, and the support of the community, was diverted to fund their extravagant lifestyle and cover gambling debts. Soon, St Ursula was deeply in debt, unable to pay its suppliers, its laborers, or even provide adequately for its own members. The buildings began to fall into disrepair, and the convent's spiritual mission suffered profoundly. The Bishop of Augsburg initiated a series of investigations. His episcopal visitations uncovered a shocking state of affairs. His reports detailed the widespread disregard for monastic discipline, the blatant financial mismanagement, and the open practice of gambling, the spiritual life of the convent had withered. The divine office was neglected, prayers were rushed or omitted, and the sisters displayed little interest in spiritual instruction or penance. The moral authority of the abbess and her leadership had evaporated, replaced by a climate of indulgence and irresponsibility. The scandal of St Ursula was not just an internal church matter. It spilled into the secular realm. Creditors, frustrated by the convent's inability to pay its debts, lodged complaints with the civic authorities of Augsburg. The city council and even the emperor's representatives became involved, as the financial insolvency of a prominent religious house had implications for the broader urban economy and civic order. The reputation of the convent, once a source of civic pride, became a source of shame and public ridicule. The Emperor Maximilian I, known for his interest in reforming religious institutions, eventually intervened. He dispatched commissioners to Augsburg to conduct a thorough inquiry into the financial state and moral conduct of St Ursula. Their findings confirmed the bishop's reports, revealing a shocking level of negligence and corruption. The emperor, through his decree, ordered a complete overhaul of the convent's administration. The abbess was removed from her office, disgraced, and perhaps even sent to a stricter convent for penance. The nuns, implicated in the most egregious gambling and excessive spending, faced various forms of punishment, from severe spiritual discipline to reassignments to other convents. A new abbess, known for her piety and administrative acumen, was appointed with the explicit mandate to restore order, enforce strict discipline, and rectify the convent's dire financial situation. The gambling implements were confiscated and destroyed, and stringent measures were put in place to ensure financial transparency and adherence to the vow of poverty. The gambling convent of Augsburg became a notorious example of monastic decay, highlighting the challenges of maintaining spiritual discipline in the face of worldly temptations and the profound consequences of unchecked financial misconduct. Number 4. The mystery of the poisoned abbess. In the solemn quiet of a French Benedictine abbey in the 12th century, a place dedicated to the peaceful pursuit of God, an act of shocking malevolence shattered the serene facade. The abbey, nestled in a secluded valley, was known for its piety and the long stable rule of its abbess, Mother Isabella. However, one ordinary morning, a profound darkness descended upon the community. Mother Isabella, seemingly in good health, suddenly fell ill and rapidly succumbed to a mysterious affliction. Her death, initially attributed to natural causes, soon became the subject of horrifying whispers. Mother Isabella, it was believed, had been poisoned, and the suspicion chillingly fell upon some of her own nuns. The initial reaction to the abbess's sudden demise would have been grief and somber mourning. A beloved or at least respected abbess's passing was a significant event for any religious community. However, as the days turned into a week, certain details began to emerge that aroused suspicion. Mother Isabella's symptoms before death were described as violent sickness, intense pain, and rapid decline, symptoms not easily explained by common illnesses of the time. Moreover, there were subtle but persistent rumors circulating among the lay servants, the cooks, and those who interacted with the outside world that all was not as it seemed. The most damning piece of evidence, or at least the most compelling in an era without forensic science, was the discovery of a peculiar substance in the abbess's personal effects, or perhaps in the residue of her last meal. While the precise nature of the poison is lost to history, medieval knowledge of herbal remedies and toxic substances was extensive, and certain poisons, like arsenic or belladonna, were known for their rapid and painful effects. The unusual circumstances of her death prompted a closer look. The bishop of the diocese, informed of the disturbing rumors, could not ignore such a grave accusation, particularly when it concerned the head of a prominent religious house. He dispatched an ecclesiastical commission to the abbey to conduct an investigation. The arrival of the bishop's representatives, often accompanied by notaries and guards, would have transformed the tranquil abbey into a scene of fearful scrutiny. Every nun became a potential witness, or, more terrifyingly, a suspect. The investigation focused on interviewing all members of the community, the nuns, the lay sisters, the servants, and anyone who had close contact with the abbess in her final days. Questions would have revolved around Mother Isabella's relationships within the abbey, any known conflicts, recent arguments, or unusual behaviors among the sisters, personal rivalries, ambition for the abbess's position, perceived injustices, or even simple resentment could have fueled such a heinous crime. While the specifics of the investigation are often scant in general historical chronicles, such inquiries typically looked for motive. Who stood to gain from the abbess's death? Was the sister who coveted her position? Had the abbess recently disciplined someone severely? Opportunity. Who had access to the abbess's food, drink, or personal chambers? Means, was there anyone in the community known to have knowledge of poisons, perhaps from tending to the sick or from a lay background? The interrogations would have been intense, conducted within the confines of the abbey, designed to uncover any hidden animosity or complicity. The fear of God's wrath and earthly punishment would have weighed heavily on the consciences of the nuns. Eventually, the focus narrowed, and the finger of suspicion pointed towards a small group of nuns within the community. The specific names are not always preserved, but accounts refer to certain sisters, whose behavior or testimonies raised serious red flags. The motive, as speculated by the investigators, was likely rooted in power and control. Mother Isabella might have been a strict ruler, her discipline perhaps too harsh for some, or perhaps she had uncovered financial irregularities or personal indiscretions among her leadership, threatening to expose them. Her removal through murder would have been seen by the perpetrators as the only way to avoid exposure or to seize power for themselves. The outcome of such an investigation was always profound. When sufficient evidence, however circumstantial by modern standards, was gathered, the accused nuns faced degradation and punishment. They would have been publicly stripped of their religious habits, symbols of their consecration, and condemned as secular criminals. In the medieval period, poisoning was a capital offense, while the Church would hand them over to the secular arm for punishment. The fate of nuns who committed such crimes could still be severe. Imprisonment, harsh penance in isolation, or even execution, though rare for women of their status, were possibilities depending on the local laws and the severity of the proof. The abbey itself would have been thrown into disarray. A successor abbess would be appointed usually by the bishop, tasked with cleansing the convent of the stain of murder and restoring spiritual order. Community would have endured a period of deep shame and internal mistrust, the memory of the poisoned abbess lingering for years. The mystery of the poisoned abbess serves as a chilling testament to the dark passions that could fester even in places ostensibly dedicated to peace and piety, proving that human frailty and malice knew no boundaries, even those of hallowed walls. Number 3. The Prophetesses of K. In the bustling, pious city of K, in the early 13th century, a phenomenon unfolded within the walls of a humble Cistercian convent that both captivated and deeply disturbed the ecclesiastical authorities. This was not a scandal of moral failing or open defiance, but one of unsettling spiritual intensity. A group of nuns within the convent began to experience profound visions, claim divine revelations, and utter prophecies that, while seemingly pious, soon ventured into territory deemed dangerously unconventional, bordering on the heretical, by the watchful eyes of the Church. These were the Prophetesses of K. The medieval period was an era of intense spiritual fervor, where visions and mystical experiences were often revered as signs of divine grace. Holy women, like Hildegard of Bingen, were celebrated for their prophetic insights. However, there was a fine line between divinely inspired revelation and dangerous delusion or even diabolical influence. The Church, ever vigilant against heterodoxy, maintained strict control over what constituted acceptable spiritual experience. Initially, the sisters' experiences might have been welcomed as signs of spiritual vitality within the convent. Accounts would circulate of nuns falling into trances, uttering words not their own, or describing vivid scenes from heaven or hell. They claimed to see Christ, the Virgin Mary, angels and saints, and to receive messages directly from the divine realm. Their words often contained warnings, exhortations to piety, or prophecies about future events concerning the church or the city. However, as the phenomena intensified, the content of their prophecies and visions began to raise concerns. Instead of merely reinforcing established doctrine, some of their revelations became increasingly unorthodox. They might have challenged the authority of the local clergy, criticized the prevailing social order, or predicted drastic changes to the church hierarchy. Perhaps their visions contained allegories, or interpretations of Scripture that deviated from approved theological understanding. Some might have claimed to possess knowledge of souls in purgatory, or even to foretell the imminent end of the world in ways that caused public alarm. The Archbishop of Cologne, a powerful spiritual and temporal leader, was eventually alerted to the situation. He would have dispatched learned theologians and experienced confessors likely from the Dominican or Franciscan orders to investigate the convent. Their mission was to discern the true nature of these spiritual manifestations. Were they indeed from God, or were they the product of human delusion, mental instability, or most terrifyingly, demonic deception? The investigation was a delicate but thorough process. The prophetesses were subjected to rigorous interviews. Their visions were recounted in detail, analyzed for their theological soundness and consistency with Christian doctrine. Their personal lives were scrutinized for any hidden sins or character flaws that might make them susceptible to diabolical influence. The investigators would look for signs of humility, obedience, and alignment with the Church's teachings. Any deviation, however subtle, could be interpreted as a sign of false prophecy. One common issue with such mystical experiences was the potential for spiritual pride. If a nun began to believe her revelations placed her above the authority of her abbess or bishop, or if she used them to gain undue influence, this was considered a grave spiritual error. The content of the prophecies was also crucial. If they contradicted church dogma, condemned the sacraments, or promoted new unauthorized rituals, they would be immediately suspect. The local chroniclers and official reports from the Archdiocese of Cologne indicate that the Archbishop and his theological advisors ultimately deemed many of the prophecies to be dangerous. While they might not have explicitly labeled them as full-blown heresy in every case, they were certainly seen as unsettling and potentially misleading to the faithful. The very public nature of these phenomena, attracting pilgrims and curious onlookers to the convent, amplified the problem. If the visions were deemed false, they could undermine the Church's authority and lead to confusion. The outcome for the prophetesses and their convent was usually a multi-pronged approach. The nuns themselves would undergo a period of spiritual correction, rigorous penance, and closer supervision. They might be forbidden from speaking of their visions publicly and subjected to continuous theological instruction. Convent, too, would be subjected to a spiritual cleansing with stricter enclosure enforced, outside visitors curtailed, and its spiritual direction placed under more direct episcopal control. Some of the most persistent or defiant prophetesses might even have been transferred to other stricter convents to break their influence. The case of the Prophetesses of Cologne serves as a fascinating example of the challenges faced by the medieval Church in discerning true spiritual inspiration from dangerous spiritual error. It highlights the profound power of belief and the pervasive concern about orthodoxy in a time when spiritual deviation could have widespread social and political ramifications. The scandal itself was not about moral failings, but about the very nature of truth and divine communication, a struggle that often left those caught in its midst profoundly changed. Number 2. The Runaway Nun and the Night. Towards the close of the 13th century, in the rugged, sun-baked lands of Castile's Spain, a scandal unfolded that was less about doctrinal dispute or conventual decay, and more about raw human passion and the dramatic breaking of sacred vows. This was the story of Sister Blanca, a nun from the austere convent of Santa Clara, and a monastic knight named Don Fernando. A tale of forbidden love that culminated in a dramatic elopement, a desperate chase, and a profound public scandal that shook the foundations of both the local church and nobility. Sister Blanca had entered the convent of Santa Clara as a young woman likely placed there by her noble family, as was common practice for daughters without a suitable marriage prospect or sufficient dowry. Her vows were meant to bind her to a life of perpetual chastity, poverty, and obedience, severing her ties to the worldly realm. For years, she had lived within the cloister, performing her duties, attending divine office, and presumably resigned to her spiritual calling. However, the convent was not entirely isolated from the outside world. Noble families maintained connections, and occasionally male relatives or benefactors would visit. It was during one such visit, perhaps during a formal meeting in the convent's parlor, or through a chance encounter during a procession or charitable event, that Sister Blanca encountered Don Fernando. Don Fernando was a knight of good standing, known for his bravery and his dashing demeanor. Whether through clandestine letters, brief, whispered conversations, or simply a powerful mutual attraction, a connection formed between the consecrated nun and the secular knight, a connection that defied every sacred and social norm. Both Sister Blanca and Don Fernando understood the profound risks involved. For a nun, breaking her vow of chastity and absconding from her convent was an act of extreme spiritual and legal transgression, carrying the gravest penalties. For a knight, aiding and abetting such an act was a serious crime, potentially incurring the wrath of the church, loss of his lands, and social disgrace. Yet, the intensity of their forbidden passion overcame their fear of consequences. Their plan was daring and desperate. One moonless night, Sister Blanca, with the alleged assistance of Don Fernando, managed to slip away from the convent. Accounts from later investigations suggest a meticulously planned escape, perhaps involving a bribed guard, a loosened window, or a secreted key. She shed her nun's habit, exchanging it for secular clothing provided by the knight, a symbolic and literal shedding of her former life. Under the cover of darkness, they fled the convent, leaving behind a community in shock and a trail of questions. The discovery of Sister Blanca's absence the next morning plunged Santa Clara into an immediate crisis. An alarm was raised. The abbess, distraught and furious, dispatched messengers to the local bishop and to Sister Blanca's family, informing them of the unthinkable act. The scandal was immediate and widespread. News of a nun abandoning her vows and eloping with a knight spread like wildfire through the noble courts and common villages of Castile. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the church and the moral order of society. The bishop of the diocese, recognizing the gravity of the situation, immediately initiated a formal pursuit. Royal authorities were also enlisted, as the flight of a noblewoman, particularly a consecrated one, had significant social and legal ramifications. A hunt for Sister Blanca and Don Fernando began. Messengers were sent to various towns and castles, descriptions were circulated, and rewards were likely offered for their apprehension. Pursuit was not merely about recovering a lost nun. It was about upholding the sanctity of vows and demonstrating the Church's unwavering power. The couple, meanwhile, attempted to make their escape. They rode hard, seeking refuge in anonymity, perhaps hoping to reach a distant land where their past would not follow them, or to find a place where they could live as husband and wife, albeit under a perpetual cloud of excommunication. However, in the interconnected world of medieval Spain, where royal and ecclesiastical networks were strong, it was exceedingly difficult for two prominent individuals to disappear entirely. The chase ended, as was often the case in such dramatic elopements, with their capture. The exact circumstances of their apprehension are not always fully detailed, but they were eventually tracked down and apprehended by the bishop's men, likely with the assistance of royal soldiers. They were brought back under guard to face the consequences of their actions. The punishments for Sister Blanca were severe. She was apprehended, stripped of her secular attire, and likely returned to the convent, though not to her former status. A nun who had broken her vows and fled was subjected to rigorous penance. She would have been publicly humiliated, forced to perform acts of atonement, and likely confined to a solitary cell, living a life of perpetual penance and repentance, often with severe dietary restrictions and physical discomforts. Her name would be struck from the convent's public records or noted with disgrace. She would never regain her full standing within the community. Don Fernando, the knight, also faced serious repercussions. He would have been excommunicated for his role in abducting a nun, a terrifying spiritual sanction. His lands could be seized, his knighthood revoked, and he would face social ostracism. His family would bear the shame of his actions. The case of the runaway nun and the knight became a notorious tale, a vivid illustration of the absolute power of vows and the Church's unyielding stance against those who dared to defy them for the sake of earthly love. It underscored the profound conflict between individual desire and the rigid expectations of medieval religious and social order. Number 1. The Possessed Sisters of Airfort. In the autumn of 1347, in the German city of Airfort, a chilling and terrifying spectacle unfolded within the enclosed walls of the Dominican convent of St. Catherine. What began as isolated incidents of strange behavior among a few nuns rapidly escalated into a full-blown crisis of alleged demonic possession that swept through the entire community. The Possessed Sisters of Airfort became a horrifying public spectacle, drawing the attention of both ecclesiastical and civic authorities and sparking widespread fear and fascination throughout the region. The initial signs were subtle. A few nuns began to exhibit unusual behaviors during divine services. They would moan, shriek, or fall into strange fits. Their bodies would contort into unnatural positions, and they would utter incomprehensible sounds or speak in voices not their own. At first, these manifestations might have been dismissed as illness, mental distress, or even pious ecstasy. However, as the number of affected sisters grew and the behaviors became more extreme and disruptive, the community could no longer ignore the sinister implications. The symptoms escalated dramatically. The nuns would bark like dogs, meow like cats, or imitate other animal sounds. They would crawl on all fours, climb onto altars, or perform grotesque dances. During prayer, they would blaspheme loudly, curse the saints, and insult the clergy. They would tear at their habits, roll on the ground, and sometimes violently lash out at those who tried to restrain them. Their eyes would reportedly roll back in their heads, and their faces contort into terrifying expressions. This was not quiet contemplation. It was a scene of utter chaos and spiritual torment. The Abbis and the convent leadership were in a state of profound distress. They initially tried traditional remedies, including intensified prayer, fasting, and spiritual discipline. However, these efforts proved futile. The manifestations continued, spreading rapidly from one nun to another, as if by contagion, until a significant portion of the community was afflicted. The convent, meant to be a haven of spiritual peace, became a house of screams, contortions, and blasphemy. The local Dominican friars, who served as the nuns' confessors and spiritual directors, were called upon to intervene. They, along with the Bishop of Airfort, concluded that the nuns were suffering not from illness, but from demonic possession. This was a grave pronouncement in medieval society, indicating a direct attack by evil forces. The only recourse in their view was exorcism. What followed was a series of public exorcisms, a terrifying ritual conducted within the convent church or in designated areas. Priests, armed with holy water crosses and sacred relics, would confront the alleged demons, commanding them to leave the bodies of the afflicted nuns. The exorcisms were often protracted and physically demanding, both for the exorcists and the possessed. The nuns would reportedly resist violently, cursing, spitting, and speaking in various demonic voices, revealing secrets or making terrifying predictions. These public displays drew crowds of curious and fearful onlookers, further amplifying the scandal and the sense of dread surrounding the convent. During these exorcisms, and in calmer moments, the possessed nuns would reportedly make accusations. They would accuse other nuns of witchcraft, of having pacts with the devil, or of introducing evil into the community. They might also confess to their own sins, often highly sexual or blasphemous in nature, which were attributed to the demonic influence. These accusations and confessions, while often discounted as unreliable due to the state of the possessed, nevertheless sowed seeds of suspicion and internal division within the community. The search for the cause of the possession was intense. Some attributed it to a specific nun who might have introduced a cursed object or engaged in dark practices. Others blamed a general decline in spiritual discipline within the convent, creating an opening for demonic entry. Some theories suggested a collective delusion or a form of mass hysteria, though these were not the prevailing medieval explanations. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe around this time, was also seen by some as a contributing factor, a sign of God's wrath and increased demonic activity. Case of the possessed sisters of Airfort lingered for an extended period, creating a profound disturbance in the city. Convent's reputation was shattered, its spiritual mission compromised. Eventually, through persistent exorcisms, rigorous spiritual discipline, and potentially the removal of some of the most severely afflicted nuns, the phenomena gradually subsided. Convent would undergo a period of intense spiritual cleansing with stricter rules enforced, and constant vigilance against any return of the dark influences. The story of the possessed sisters of Airfort stands as one of the most chilling and perplexing scandals of the medieval period. It highlights the profound power of belief in the supernatural, the deeply held fear of demonic forces, and the desperate measures taken by the Church to combat what it perceived as a direct assault from hell. It left behind a legacy of terror and a stark reminder that even within the sacred walls of a convent, the spiritual battlefield could erupt into horrifying reality.